Good evening to everyone. It's good to see all who are able to be here for our afternoon service, and we're very thankful for everyone's presence. We're going to be continuing our study in the book of Hebrews, as was announced, and you can see on the board. Last Lord's Day, we began chapter 7, and we're able to make it through the first 10 verses. And Lord willing, this evening we'll go ahead and finish out chapter 7. In this passage, we find ourselves in the section of Hebrews that is really the lengthiest argument of the book, and that is the argument of Jesus' superior high priesthood. You might remember just our outline. The book of Hebrews has been talking about the superiority of Jesus over all things, written or spoken to a people that were probably Jewish in background, but they had become Christians. They had obeyed the gospel. They were following Christ. But perhaps due to persecution, perhaps due to other reasons in their lives, there was a great temptation to return to what they had come from. There was a temptation to return to Judaism, to the familiarity, to the lack of persecution that they may have under that system. And so this letter is addressed to them, this sermon is addressed to them, showing them why to return to Judaism would be such a devastating mistake. And there's a lot of reasons that could be said. There's a lot of reasons that they could be shown why that was a foolish choice. But the way that the Hebrew author decides to tackle the issue is to show them the superior nature of Jesus. And thus, anything that they do, anything they go back to, is leaving the superior for the inferior. And so again, as we've said throughout this study many times, while it may be interesting and intriguing, it may be nice to get a better grasp of some of these passages that seem a bit confusing, we may wonder, well, what does that have to do with us? We're probably not very tempted to go back to Judaism. I don't think any of us are tempted to go back to Judaism. Most of us aren't probably tempted to go to Judaism. But the message itself rings true even for us today. And that is to leave Jesus, to leave the church. There's a lot of reasons that may be foolish, that may be a bad idea. But perhaps the best message that we could teach to one another and to anyone that would be contemplating giving up is to remind them of how great Jesus is, the superior nature of Jesus in all things, and to remind ourselves and our brothers and sisters that may face that challenge from time to time, that to leave Jesus behind would be leaving the greatest thing we could possess, to be leaving the greatest one we could follow for something inferior, whatever that thing might be. And so the Hebrew writer has shown Jesus to be superior to prophets, to the angels, to Moses, and then he begins to talk about the superior priesthood of Jesus. Now that was introduced in chapter 4 and 5, and then there was a lengthy warning section, but he comes back in chapter 7 to this idea of the priesthood of Jesus. You remember what a priest does and what a man needs. We're not going to spend more time on those things since we've covered that in previous lessons. In our last sermon, just a couple of things from chapter 7, verses 1 through 10, as the introduction to the priesthood section begins. There's that lengthy warning. Then chapter 7 begins anew where the introduction had left off, that Jesus is a superior priest. Now that brings up a question, how is Jesus a priest? Because the old system, the priests were all Levites, but Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And this is one of the most perhaps confusing parts of Hebrews, because Melchizedek is such a ambiguous character. There's only a couple of verses about him in the entire Old Testament, and yet the primary argument of Hebrews, Jesus' superior priesthood, begins with this character and makes a big deal about this man. So we talked about Melchizedek, who he was. We're not going to re-go through all of those things. The one thing I wanted to put this slide up for and remind us is that the way Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek and how Melchizedek represents Jesus is he was really a typological looking forward to. He was a king, he was a priest, and the way Scripture tells the story, as great as that man was, his story is so told in such a truncated format that he becomes a great foreshadowing. He becomes a picture. He becomes one who resembles who Jesus would be as the great high priest. One of the things this is showing is that it was always in God's mind, and it was always God's plan to get to Jesus. Jesus was not a stopgap because Judaism had failed. Judaism was never meant to be the final will of God. And this is shown in the typological story of Melchizedek. And when I say typological, I don't mean Melchizedek wasn't a real person. He was. But in the fact that he is a type. And in some of the things we're going to see tonight, we'll see this was always the plan. And part of the argument as we talk about Melchizedek is that the Melchizedekian priesthood, or Melchizedek as a priest, was greater than the Levitical priesthood. Now that doesn't mean the Levitical priesthood was bad. The Levitical priesthood was part of God's plan. It was part of God's design. God gave the law. God called Aaron to be the high priest. God dictated that his sons after him would be the high priests. But the scriptures make it clear that Melchizedek's priesthood was still greater. Well, the obvious point there is, if Jesus is a priest after the style or in likeness of Melchizedek, and Melchizedek's priesthood is greater than the Levite priesthood, then Jesus' priesthood is greater than the Levite priesthood. So he's made these points. Don't go back to the old way. You don't go back to Moses. Don't go back to these other things that are inferior. And don't go back to a priestly system. And we all need a priest. We've talked about the need for a priest. Don't go back to an inferior priesthood. And so as he's painted this picture of Melchizedek that we studied last Sunday through verse 10, he then makes this point. And by the way, I titled this sermon, I apologize for the laziness. It was at the end of putting this together that I realized this is really not the order of Melchizedek part 2. It's going to make some points about Melchizedek, but really the Melchizedek section of this passage is over. And from verse 11 through 28, this is speaking about Jesus' priesthood. Now it quotes a passage that is talking, Psalm 110 verse 4, that mentions Melchizedek, but both times it's mentioned in chapter 7, it's about how that applies to Jesus. And so really, the rest of this chapter is showing Jesus' priesthood is superior. So let's look at verses 11 through 14. Notice the first thing he says as he begins focusing specifically on Jesus' priesthood. He says, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise? Now he mentions, and that's after the order of Melchizedek. Now, we think about perfection. And sometimes we may think, well, perfection is not possible. And on our own, perfection is not possible. We are imperfect. Once we sin, we've sinned, and we can never change that. But with God, all things are possible. And by the power of Jesus' blood, we can be completely forgiven. We're going to see that a little bit later. We can be saved completely to the uttermost. But he is saying, the Hebrew writer is saying, that was not possible. This is an idea that's going to be found again. He's going to define this later. And maybe you've noticed this happens a lot in the book of Hebrews. An idea is introduced, and that might sound familiar if you've read Hebrews several times, because he introduces it in the middle of one argument, and he's going to expand it later. And in chapters 8 and 9 and 10, he's going to talk even more about the reason that this is true. The fact that the blood of bulls and goats couldn't wash away sins. But here he simply assumes and makes that point. The old system, the Levitical priesthood, and by comparison, the law that it was a part of, the Mosaic law, could not bring perfection. He's insinuating, and he's going to state explicitly, that the new covenant can. Jesus' priesthood can. And so, if you are giving up on Jesus, you are leaving the one priest who can bring you near to God, the one priest who can make you perfect, and you're going to return to a system that never could. It wasn't designed to do that. It was never meant by God to perfect man. It was meant, as Paul argues in Galatians, to bring mankind to who? To Jesus. And by the way, this chapter we're going through today, as I was reading and studying, I thought a great companion to this chapter is really the book of Galatians. So that's just food for thought there. So perfection was not available through the Mosaic covenant or that priesthood, and so there was clearly another need for another priest to arise. Otherwise, why would this have been done? And it's also clear, and we're going to see this in a moment, I'm a little ahead of myself, but this was foretold. This wasn't that the Mosaic system failed And God was surprised, and so God had to call an audible and send Jesus instead. Because even while David, perhaps the highest point in the era of the Mosaic covenant, in David's days, God promised another priest. It was always the plan of God. Now, what that also tells us, what that should tell us clearly, is when there is a change in a priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. This is one of the most, in my mind, explicit statements about the difference between the old and the new covenant. And it amazes me to talk, and I don't say, I shouldn't say that because I don't want to sound arrogant or lifted up, but it does surprise me how often you find in the religious world people that essentially say there has always been one covenant. That there really is nothing new about the new covenant. It just, the temple aspect has changed. I've had people tell me that, well, basically we're still under the same covenant. It's just Jesus is the new temple. I've had people say, well, it's always been the same plan. It's always been the same covenant. There's just more of a hyper-awareness of God's promises because of Jesus. But that's not true. And the Hebrew writer says clearly, if there is a change of a priesthood, and everybody has to agree there's been a change of priesthood, if you follow Christ, you have to admit that Jesus is the great high priest. And you have to admit, as we're going to see, Jesus cannot be a priest after the order of Levi. So there's a different priesthood. And that is contradictory to the law of Moses. It is wrong for Jesus to be a priest under the law of Moses. So how can he be a priest? Because there's a new law. That's how. And that means that if there's a new law, that the old laws is going to be made clear multiple times in the remainder of Hebrews, is done away with. Now we learn a lot. That doesn't mean that the law, that we should just throw away our Old Testaments. After all, the Old Testament is how we have a lot of the arguments in Hebrews 10. If we didn't have the Old Testament, we wouldn't have Genesis 14 and Psalm 110 to tell us about Melchizedek. There's a lot of learning that we can get from the Old Testament. There's a lot of proof that we can get from the Old Testament that Jesus is who we hope he is. But when it comes to learning how it is that we are saved, how we are added to the kingdom, how we worship God, what our moral code is, those things do not come from the law of Moses. They come from the law of Christ. They come from the new covenant, which, as we're going to see very shortly, is a better covenant. And he shows this again in verses 13 and 14, the fact that Jesus could not be a priest under the old law, because he says, the one of whom these things are spoken, that is Jesus, belonged to another tribe, from which no one has ever served at the altar. No one, rightfully speaking that is, ever served at the altar from the tribe of Judah. One king tried that. I believe it was Uzziah, and he was stricken with leprosy for entering the temple because it wasn't his right and it was against the law of Moses. It was against God's commands. So Judah never served at the altar. But he says, but our Lord was descended from Judah, and Moses says nothing about priests. So clearly, something has changed. He goes on then to say, this becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek. Now, I've looked at this quite a bit, and you may be able to convince me of something different. That probably wouldn't be too hard to do, because I've really scratched my head about what the this refers to. And there's several verses that maybe the this refers to, but I think the this here, when he says this becomes more evident, what becomes more evident? I think the idea in verse 12 that there has been a change in the law. This is what has become even more evident. Now, he could be referring to the superiority of Jesus' priesthood. There could be a few other possibilities, but I think this fits the best idea of the context of the passage. The change in the law that is brought about by Jesus' priesthood becomes even more evident, he says, when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek. Now, what again is that? Not to re-preach that. The simple way that I'll sum up the likeness of Melchizedek is a superior king-priest or priest-king. Those were the two big things. Melchizedek was superior to Abraham and thus to his descendants. And he was not just a priest, but he was a king and a priest. And I think that is the key concept of why Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek, because he's not just a priest, he is both priest and king. Now notice what he says. How is it that Jesus became priest? Well, he becomes priest a different way than any of the priests under the Old Testament or the Mosaic system. And the way he becomes a priest, as we might suspect, is superior in the way that the other priests became priests. All the high priests in Israel became high priests, because they were born to the high priest. That's all. Now, some of them were pretty lousy men, by the way. You can read of some pretty terrible high priests, but it was their right to be the high priest because they were the son of the high priest. But Jesus, on the other hand, it's not about his bodily descent. It's not about his lineage. And remember, by the way, we're not told a lineage about Melchizedek, because Christ's lineage is important for his kingship, but it's not important for his priesthood. Instead, we're told that the power of his priesthood comes from an indestructible life. And this introduces a concept that weaves its way throughout the remainder of this passage, and that is the eternal nature, the permanent nature of Jesus' priesthood. An indestructible life. I didn't look it up, but I don't think there's another time in the New Testament that phrase itself there is used. But I think that's an interesting way. It's a powerful way. An indestructible life. Now, Jesus died on the cross. Jesus was beaten, humiliated, and gave up his life on the cross. But he was indestructible, because the grave did not hold him. 3 days later, of course, he came. And by the way, that was to fulfill prophecy. He didn't have to wait 3 days to resurrect. Death could not hold him. That reminds me of Jesus' promise to us and warning to us. Remember when he says, "Do not fear him who can kill the body." That's a big challenge, because we're all afraid of death. None of us just want to die. And so it is kind of frightening to think of a person that can take our life. And so when someone threatens us, when someone persecutes us to the point, and most of us here, or maybe all of us, I don't think have ever faced this, but many Christians have, when we're faced with either give up your faith or die, that's a frightening thing. But Jesus says you don't fear that person, because the only thing they can take from you is your physical life, but they cannot destroy you. But you should absolutely fear the one who can not only take your life, but can condemn your soul. You see, the faithful in Christ Jesus enjoy this also. The faithful in Christ have an indestructible life, because we are promised to have a resurrection and to enjoy a resurrection like his. And so that individual that may kill you because of your faith, your life is indestructible. So what does it matter in eternity? Jesus has an indestructible life. And this moves him into the quotation about Melchizedek. Here he quotes, "You are a priest forever." It says, "It is witnessed of him." And notice what the Hebrew says. It is witnessed of him, and he's speaking of Jesus. So he says explicitly that when David wrote Psalm 110, verse 4, this was a witness, and this is an inspired psalm, so this is the Holy Spirit, this is God witnessing about Jesus. And he says, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." Now, Melchizedek kind of typified this, because we don't read about his birth and we don't read about his death, but I think we would all agree that Melchizedek did not have a priesthood that lasted forever. We don't keep reading about Melchizedek's priesthood. But it was promised that there would be one like Melchizedek, a superior king priest, whose priesthood would go on forever. And remember, I've already alluded to this, but this was written by David. This was written at the height, the golden age of Israel's history. And even then, when it might seem like this was the way to redeem mankind, that through Israel and through the monarchy of David and through their physical kingdom, this may be God's plan. At that point, David said, there is going to be another priest of a different order that's not like our priest, and he will be forever. That will be the priest that can draw us near to God. Now, compare that with the priests of the law and the Levitical system. He says, for on one hand, a former commandment is set aside. And listen to the way it describes the law. Because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. Now, the Hebrew writer is not trying to be derogatory here. He's just showing the ultimate. If you take Jesus out of the picture, if there was never a future of Jesus, and you just have the law of Moses itself, it's weak, it's useless, and it makes nothing perfect. And because of that, it was never the intent of God to use that. And so when Jesus comes, and when the old law has fulfilled its purpose of bringing us to Christ, and when Christ has fulfilled the laws He promised He would do, that old law was set aside. Here's another explicit statement. Are we under the old covenant today? Absolutely not, because it has been set aside. Can we still learn from it? Of course we can. I think we should. I love studying the Old Testament. I love preaching from the Old Testament. But are we under the Old Testament? No. It has been set aside. On the other hand, while this law, which was a great law, and that might sound kind of sad. You know, it's easy for you and I to talk this way, but I want you to imagine you grew up a Jew. And your ancestors for the last 1,000 years have been Jewish. And this preacher is saying, this law that your parents and that your grandparents and great-great-great-grandparents and you were a part of, it's weak and it's useless, and it has been set aside. That would sting a little bit, wouldn't it? But it wouldn't sting nearly as much if you were reminded of what you received in return. So while the law was set aside, on the other hand, a better hope is introduced. A better hope than they could ever have under that system. A better hope than they had with bulls and goats being sacrificed. A better hope than having a man who was maybe a good man or maybe not a good man be your representative who drew near into the presence of God in the most holy place. A better hope than the law of Moses ever offered. And look at what a hope it is. It is a hope through which we draw near to God. This is an idea that was introduced back in chapter 4, I believe, the concept of drawing near to God. And it's found, I guess if I'd look at my slide, I wouldn't have to guess. It's 4 verse 16. It's mentioned again later in chapter 7. It's mentioned in chapter 2. It's mentioned in chapter 11. This becomes one of the themes of Hebrews. In Christ, and only in Christ, all of us have the grand privilege of drawing near to God. You don't need another man who's going to have to offer a sacrifice for himself first, then draw near to God for you and on your behalf. You can draw near to God through Jesus. Well, verses 20 and 21. Our next point, and it was not without an oath. So this priesthood that he's speaking about, first of all, it was because of an indestructible life. And that was shown by the fact that David said, not only will there be a new priest, not only will the Messiah be a priest like Melchizedek, but he will be a priest forever. So an indestructible life shows Jesus is that priest. But also, it is because of an oath from God. Now this probably should remind us of what we've already read back in chapter 6, when the Hebrew writer made a really big deal about when God wanted to make something sure to Abraham, he swore an oath by himself. When God says something, you can count on it. When God swears an oath on something, it is highly emphasized. And this is one of the things that God has sworn. Now, the other priests, there wasn't any oath that God made concerning the priests of Aaron. He gave a command. He said, I have selected Aaron, and from now on, his sons will be the priests. So it was a part of the law. But it wasn't accompanied by an oath or a promise. But the priesthood of Jesus was promised. And not only was it promised in the sense of being foretold, God swore this is what was going to happen. This is Psalm 110, verse 4. Earlier, he had quoted the latter half of the verse. Now he quotes the first 3/4 of the verse of Psalm 110, verse 4. He says, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever." And that is, in context, being spoken to David's Lord, the Messiah. And again, this was written after the establishment of the Aaronic priesthood. This was written after years, decades, centuries after Aaron's lineage began serving as the high priest. God made it clear that there was going to be another priesthood. So this wasn't a surprise. This wasn't something that they should really be bewildered at. Instead, they should be thankful that they get to live in the era where this promise has been fulfilled and where they are reaping the benefits of God's plan coming to fruition. Well, verses 22 through 25, he says something here. He makes some conclusions. Because of all of these, because Jesus is clearly this priest, because he's been promised, because God swore this would happen, because he is a priest based on the power of an indestructible life, and thus, he's logically said, this means there has to be a new law, and the old law has been set aside, but this covenant, he says, is a better covenant. Jesus has guaranteed us a better covenant. How often do you trade something in for something worse? Or maybe if you're forced to. But do you really want to take your car in and trade it for a worse car? Do you want to trade your house for one that's falling down and has a bunch of problems? Do you want to trade the clothes that you have in for clothes that don't fit, and clothes that are worn out, and clothes that are worse? You want to trade your job for a worse job with worse pay and worse benefits and more hours? No, you don't trade something better for something worse. And yet how often, not only then, but now, do people do that very thing in the most important facet of their lives, where they trade their faith, they trade their commitment to Jesus for something else. Now for the Jews, they were being tempted to reject the new covenant for the covenant of Moses, which wasn't a better covenant. Today, people want to reject the faith so they can go back to worldliness, or maybe to some other belief. And you can be guaranteed of this: whatever you're trading your faith for, whatever you're trading Christ for, you're on the losing end of that deal. You're leaving the better for the worse. He speaks about now he highlights another nature of Jesus' superior priesthood. The former priests, there were a lot of them. In fact, I was kind of trying to find a list, and I thought about putting one up, but I couldn't find one that I really liked, and it's a pretty long list. If you go through and list all of the high priests that ever served, there were somewhere around 67 by the time of Jesus. There were quite a few priests. And you might have a good priest. You may be blessed to live under the era of one of those really good men. And then what happened? He died because he was a man. Think about Eli. He was a pretty good man. And then they had to deal with his sons that abused women and stole sacrifices. But there wasn't anything the people could do about that, because they were the rightful priests, even if they weren't doing it rightly. But with Jesus, he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. We all know the stress that comes with change. We deal with that politically. Every 4 years we have an election cycle, at least in the presidential realm. And sometimes people want to change, or there's a big group of people that want to change, and there's always a big group of people that don't want to change. And then there's a lot of people that just get frustrated with how hard it is to go through a change. It'd be nice if there was just some consistency. Have you ever gone through a change at work? Your boss changes, your manager changes. Maybe there's some good things, maybe there's bad, but it's a hard transition for a while. Change is hard. And I'm sure the change from the old to the new was hard for these people. But what a blessing to know there's no more change coming. Certainly no more change coming because your high priest is going to die. Because Jesus continues forever. And notice what this means. I like the way he says that it's almost an afterthought. And by the way, consequently, that means he is able to save to the uttermost. Completely. Absolutely. Without a question. He can save you. As again, not to get too far ahead in Hebrews, didn't matter how many how much lamb's blood was spilt. It didn't matter how many bulls you offered. It didn't matter how many goats and turtle doves and everything else you brought to the priest. None of that could save you to the uttermost. But Jesus can. And what a wonderful promise. Even if you don't worry about the context of Jewish people going back to Judaism and all of that, what a wonderful promise to just meditate on sometime. That you have a Savior who can save you completely. All of those weaknesses you deal with, all of those sins you feel guilty about, the ones others know about, and the ones nobody knows about, all of those problems and weaknesses in your life, He can overcome that. He can save you from that. And thus, you can draw near to God. But notice also the qualification, who is saved the uttermost? It is those who draw near to God through Him. This is not just something that Jesus does against our will. It's not something that happens to the universal race of mankind. He saves those who strive to draw near to God through Him. And you could give a whole lesson on what through Him means. But it's by faithfulness to Him, by placing our faith in Him, by obeying Him. Hebrews is going to have a lot to say about belief and obedience in the final chapters. But also to know that He is always there to make intercession for us. Well, let's look at the final few verses here. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest as Jesus. I think I need to think about this verse a little bit more, but I find that a comforting verse. We often talk about, and this is true, we talk about how worthless we are, how undeserving we are before God. We don't deserve God's grace. We don't deserve the blood of Christ, and that's all true. I agree with all of that. But isn't it interesting that God thought it was fitting? He thought it was appropriate that we have a perfect high priest. That He saw fit to send His Son, and that Jesus was willing to come to be a man and to be tempted as we are, yet without sin, as Hebrews has already told us, to endure the weakness so that He could sympathize with us, a need for our high priest, and yet that He would do so sinlessly, so that He could not only be the perfect sin sacrifice, but He could be the priest that was appropriate for us. The priest that fit our need. And look at the way He's described. He is described as holy. Now this is a slightly different Greek word than the one that's usually used for holy, and it means pleasing to God. Now all of those other priests, they could please God if they strove to be faithful to Him, but every one of those priests before had some sin in their lives. I mean, think about the first high priest. Who was the first high priest in the law of Moses? It was Aaron. And it wasn't all that long before Aaron put on the priestly garments for the first time and had the oil poured on him and was consecrated to the service that Aaron had built a golden calf for the nation to worship. Do you think anyone ever might have remembered that event and wondered in their mind, why is he the one that's drawing near to God for me? I bet some people wondered that. He was probably one of the best high priests Israel ever had. But Jesus is holy. He is fully acceptable and pleasing to God. He's innocent. There is nothing that can be laid against him. He is unstained, completely whole. And thus, while he has shared in our weaknesses of flesh as far as what it means to live a mortal life, while he has shared in the temptations that we are tempted with, he is completely separate from us because he has never sinned. And thus he has been exalted above the heavens. This gets to another concept that's also quoted in Psalms, the idea of ascending to the right hand of God, sitting at God's right hand until the enemies are made a footstool. These are some other concepts that will come up. But notice this final verse. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. Which priest do you want? The priest of the law or the priest of the oath? Priests that are sons of Aaron or a priest that is the Son of God? Priests that can best be described with the word weakness. And that's not a slight against them because that's the word that best describes you and I. Or a priest who is best described by the word perfect. And so this latter portion of Hebrews chapter 7, the first 10 verses showed the greatness, the greater or the superior nature of Melchizedek to Aaron. But this latter part has really focused entirely on Jesus versus the Aaronic priesthood. Jesus' priesthood is based on God's promise. By the way, that's another interesting similarity to the letter of Galatians. One of the big arguments of Galatians is the superiority of God's promise to Abraham as opposed to the law. Now, it's not the exact same argument because Paul makes that argument that the promise predated the law. But here we do see the superior nature of the oath, which was given after the law of Moses. But the oath, the promise, once again, is what? Is greater than the law. We see that Jesus has a permanent priesthood, whereas the priests of Aaron died. That Jesus is able to save to the uttermost. The Aaronic priests cannot make perfect. Jesus is appointed in power. The priests of Aaron are appointed in their weakness. Jesus provides a better hope. The priesthood of Aaron has been set aside. Jesus is the Son of God. The priests of Aaron are simply sons of Aaron. All points to the simple fact: Jesus is superior. And I realize by this point in our Hebrew study that may be sounding cliche. Jesus is better. Jesus is greater. Jesus is superior. But the truth is, we cannot emphasize it enough. Because when you leave this building tonight, and when you go about your day tomorrow and whatever other days God gives you, what Satan is going to do constantly is try and get you to believe in one way or one fashion that something else is greater. Your job, your entertainment, your pleasure, whatever it may be. He's going to try and get you to think that something else is better, and you must be completely bought in and completely faithful and trusting in the idea that Jesus is better. And only when we trust in Him absolutely and follow Him do we have the grand privilege of drawing near to God. Nothing else can draw you to God. But Jesus can. And Jesus wants to. And only Jesus will truly bridge the gap between humanity and God. Only Jesus will be able to take us home to live with God forevermore. So don't turn your back. Keep following Jesus. Well, that brings us to the end of Hebrews chapter 7. Hebrews chapter 8 begins with a wonderful connection to this. It goes on to make more arguments about the superior nature of Jesus' priesthood and his sacrifice. I look forward to hearing those lessons. I look forward to studying those as a congregation. I hope that you're excited about those things as well.